So good morning. Hope everyone's doing well. I hope your 2023 has started off strong. Dorian talked about the beginning of the year being when we kind of set goals. We think many of you maybe you make a New Year's resolution. I came across an article that was sharing about some research that had to do with New Year's resolutions that I thought was pretty interesting. So this is January 8th, right? We're starting the second week of January. And so they surveyed a whole bunch of people and a lot of activities over a couple of years, and they determined what the average date was when people break their resolution that they've taken. So do you know what date the average date is when you kind of stop doing what your resolution was? So January 12th. All right, so you have 40. If you're still sticking with your resolution, and you can stick with it for 4 more days, you'll be better than average, because the average is. And then also went on to talk about. Do you know what percentage of people follow through and keep their resolutions? It's actually more than I thought it would be. It's 8%. It said stick with their resolutions. So anyway, if you make I don't know how many people make resolutions these days, but if you do, that's kind of what you're up against. So if you're sticking at it 4 more days, just 4 more days. All right, so as Dorian mentioned, we're starting a new series today, and it's called Reset, which is pretty fitting for beginning the year and talking about resolutions. And what we're going to be doing in this series is looking at some of those foundational principles that go into building our faith. And it's something that's going to be relevant whether you have been a part of the Christian faith for many, many years, or maybe something that you're just investigating. So I hope that you're going to be able to get something out of not only today, but out of this whole series. Now, any group, whether it's a company, a club, or a church, they tend to have their own language, right? They have their own words that they use, or they may take words that you used elsewhere, and they use their own definitions. I've had a pretty eclectic background of companies that I've worked with, and it seems like whenever I've changed companies, I'm always handed a document, which is, this is what all these words mean and all these acronyms mean, and it's always different in every company that you go to. And as I said, churches are no different, right? We have our own words that we use, and we often give kind of our own definitions to some words that you used elsewhere. And, I think about words like, sanctification and propitiation, which are not really necessarily churchy words, but we've kind of have made them churchy words in how we use them. And over the next few weeks, we're going to look at one of those words. We're going to look at the word grace, which is a word that actually has a lot of different definitions. And it's also a word that gets used so much in the church that it often gets taken for granted, and we can easily not realize exactly what it means. And so we're going to dig into this a little bit. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at 3 things. Those 3 things. We're going to look at, what is it? Grace, what is it? Why do we need it? And how do we get it? All right, those 3 things. What is it? Why do we need it? And how do we get it? So we'll start with, what is it? Now, the word grace has several different meanings. One of the things that's confusing about it is it can be a verb or it can be a noun, right? And as a verb, grace has synonyms like beautify or embellish. For example, many fine paintings graced the rooms of the house, right? That's a use of the word grace. Or, we're glad the movie star chose to grace us with her presence. So that's one way you could word the word grace as a verb. As a noun, it has a couple of different meanings. For example, it's a prayer that you might say before a meal, right? Let's say grace, and you give that prayer. It can also refer to charm and loveliness, such as, we watched her skate with effortless grace across the ice. But when you look in the church, right, here's one of those examples where we have yet a different meaning when we use the word grace. So the word we translate grace in our English Bible comes from the New Testament Greek. The word is charis, and I think it could be easily summed up with the words of author Paul Zale, and he put it this way: grace is unconditional love toward a person who does not deserve it. Unconditional love toward a person who does not deserve it. Now, sometimes I'll hear, and it's easy to think about mercy and grace as being synonyms, but they're not really. Mercy is not getting a punishment that you deserve. And grace is the complement. It's getting a reward that you didn't deserve. So mercy's not getting a punishment you deserve, whereas grace is getting a reward that you didn't deserve. See that difference in the two? Now, in the classic book, Les Miserables, there we go. It's by Victor Hugo. It's a great book, and it's a great musical. In fact, I think it's my favorite musical ever, and so I was really psyched when, she was right there. Kaylee, what was in Les Miserables a couple of years ago. I got to see her in it. But anyway, it's a great story. And one of the storylines is Valjean is the main character. And he's a convict who has broken parole. And he is taken in by a bishop. And Valjean is in really desperate straits. And he decides to run off with the bishop's silver. But he is caught by the police, and they bring him back to the bishop. And I want to show you a scene. There's Kaylee. I was just shouting out your performance in Les Miserables because I'm talking about Les Mis. I think you're in Cinderella next week, right? Little Mermaid. She is always in something, which is awesome. All right. So they bring him back. The police bring him back to the bishop. And so now I want to show you a scene. This is from the 2012 movie, Les Miserables. And it's the scene when Valjean is brought back to the bishop. And I want you to see what happens.
Down! Stay there! Monsignor, we have your silver. We caught this man red-handed.
You had the nerve to say you gave him this?
That is right. But my friend, you left so early. Surely something slipped your mind. You forgot. I gave these also. Would you leave the best behind? Monsieur, release him. This man has spoken true. I commend you for your duty. Now God's blessing go with you. But remember this, my brother. See in this some higher plan. You must use this precious silver to become an honest man. By the witness of the martyrs, by the passion and the blood, God has raised you out of darkness. I have saved your soul for God.
Just makes you want to break into song, doesn't it? Anyway, that is just a great example of mercy and grace that's happening, right? Valjean receives mercy when he is spared being punished, which is a punishment that he would deserve for stealing the bishop's silver. And then the bishop shows grace to Valjean by letting him then take not only the silver, but he gives him candlesticks on top of that, telling him to use them to make himself a better man. The bishop shows Valjean love that he doesn't deserve, and because he did nothing to earn it. He just needed to accept the gift from the bishop and to move on. So that explains what grace is, right? It's God giving us things that we don't deserve, which is a nice sentiment. The next question is, why do we need it? Why do we need it? So I have a prop here I'm going to use. I'm going to Here's my prop. You see, most people, regardless of their religious upbringing, when they're asked, what determines your fate after you die? They're going to give an answer that's kind of something like this. I'm going to add to my props here. They basically say, well, you know, the way it kind of works is that God has this grand cosmic scale, which this is a rough approximation of a cosmic scale, and when we enter heaven, it's going to use it to determine if we qualify to go to heaven or not, when we die. And, God's going to put all of the bad things that we've done here on one side of the scale, and then he's going to, I'm going to take it out while I move around a little bit. And then he's going to put, all the good things that we've done on the other side of the scale, and we hope that in the end, that it's going to balance out the right way. And, we don't really know necessarily how he's scoring different things that we've done, good or bad. But in the end, if the good side outweighs the bad side, then God will let us into heaven. That's actually a kind of a common tenet across kind of many different religions, and even folks who aren't, associated with any particular religion. It's a very common view of what's going to happen after we die. And, that puts a lot of motivation, a lot of weight, so to speak, on making sure that we're doing good things. It also helps make it feel like it's kind of within our control. As long as we're doing the good things, and we do more good things than bad things in our mind, then God's going to have to let us into heaven. It kind of gives us kind of a feeling like we have a bit of control, like God owes it to us to do that. Of course, the challenge is that's not really the picture that the Bible paints, and it's also not really the way it works here on earth. I mean, imagine that you had committed a crime, and you are you're caught, and you're taken before a judge, and he said, you've been found guilty of committing this crime, and your defense is, yeah, I know, but I have done all these really good things, and I've done so many good things that you should not punish me for this bad thing I've done. That's not how it works, right? If you've committed the crime, then you're going to have to do the time. It doesn't matter if you've done some other good things as well. So this kind of idea of God weighing things, it doesn't really hold up. And it is no different in the Bible, right? So I'm going to go over this kind of quickly, and it's worthy of plenty of other sermons and talks in the future. But, right, the Bible says that we're all guilty of committing a crime, right? It refers to this as sin. No, that's a little, there we go. Right, we're all guilty of committing a crime that the Bible refers to as sin. For example, Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And the Bible also says that there is a punishment for that sin, and it's separation from God, which it refers to in places as death. There you see Romans 6:23, "For the wages of sin is death." Now again, I'm kind of glossing over this quickly, and if you have other questions, we can talk about it, and it's going to be, it's worthy of other sermons in the future. But this just kind of illustrates that fundamentally, why we need God's grace is that we've done a crime and we need to do the time unless God's going to intervene in some way. So, what is grace? It's getting favor that we don't deserve from God. And why is it that we need it? It's because we've committed this crime of sin, and that it has a penalty and a punishment that needs to be paid. So that brings us to point number 3. Point number 3, how do we get it? What does it mean to get God's grace? Is it like this dust that's sprinkled on us? What does that mean? Now, I'm going to go ahead and put this back in here. Now, most of you know that this is where the death of Jesus comes in, right? We talk about how Jesus paid the penalty for our sin by dying on the cross. And it's something that in Christianity we refer to as the gospel or the good news, right? But have you ever really stopped to think about it? Why did Jesus have to die because of our sin? For many people outside the church, and even for a lot of people inside the church, that's actually a bigger question than, is there a God at all? It's this question of, why did Jesus have to die? Couldn't God just forgive us? And then we wouldn't have to face that punishment? It kind of makes the Christian God sound like the vengeful gods of primitive times that needed to be appeased with a human sacrifice. Couldn't he simply show us mercy by not giving us a punishment that we deserve and extend us grace by letting us into heaven even if we don't really deserve it? Couldn't God choose just to forgive us? Well, the truth is that God does forgive us. The challenge is that we often take for granted what it means and what it takes to truly forgive someone, because it is actually so much more than just choosing to turn a blind eye when someone has wronged us. So this is where we have to put our thinking caps on for a bit. And to explain it, I want to use an example from economics that I have blatantly stolen from Tim Keller in his book, Reason for God, which is it's a great book if you haven't read it. I highly recommend it. Now, I know economics might be a scary word for some people, and it's not a word that we would expect to hear in church, but it actually does a great job of explaining what forgiveness really means. And so I'm going to tell a story, okay? So here's the situation. So this is Julie. Okay, Julie lives in a nice house surrounded by some nice neighbors. And one of those neighbors here is Frank, right? Frank and Julie have been good friends for a long time, live right next door to each other. So one day, Frank hops in his car, and he begins to pull out into the street. But he's not really paying attention like he should. And wouldn't you know it, he runs into the gate and this rock wall on Julie's property. And unfortunately, neither Frank's auto insurance or Julie's property insurance will cover repairs to the gate and to the rock wall. So what's Julie going to do? Well, she basically has two options. Okay, the first one is she can say, Frank, you need to pay for that damage. And Frank has to pay to repair the damage that was caused. Or she can say, all right, I'll pay for it out of the goodness of my heart. And then there's some middle ground where maybe they split it 50-50 or something like that. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, someone has to pay for the damage that Frank caused. So if Julie wants to forgive Frank for damaging the rock wall, it requires for her to be willing to pay for that. Now, most of the time, when someone does something wrong to us, it's hard to think about it in purely economic terms like that, right? Even in this case, you might be thinking, well, couldn't Julie just tell Frank that he's forgiven and then choose not to spend the money herself on repairing the rock wall and the damage that was done? And she could, but even then, she still pays a price for forgiving Frank. It's just that it's not a monetary price, right? Instead, she pays an emotional price of losing her nice wall and having to live with damaged property. But no matter what option is chosen, someone has to absorb the cost of the damage. That cost, that debt that was created when that damage was caused, doesn't just vanish into thin air. And that's how it works most of the time when someone does something wrong to us. Someone may have said something hurtful to us or spread gossip about us to some of our friends. They might have done something underhanded to get the promotion or make the sale or get the date. We can't put a price tag on something like that, but there is still a sense that someone has done something wrong toward us, that has damaged the relationship that we have with them, and that's not simply going to vanish. It creates a debt. It creates a sense that the person that wronged us now owes us something because of what they've done. And we have a choice about how to respond when that happens, right? We have two choices. The first thing that we could choose to do is to make them pay for what they've done. And there's lots of ways that we can choose to do that, right? We can stop talking to them. Or we can say mean things to them or about them, or we could even get physical. And if they suffer, we may begin to feel a certain bit of satisfaction, feeling that maybe now they are starting to pay off that debt of what they owed us for how they wronged us. Can any of you kind of relate to that? Some of those feelings you might have towards someone? But there are some real problems with that option. There are some real problems. Choosing that kind of revenge to make them pay likely sets off a cycle of reaction and retaliation that's going to grow over time. And those actions, when we take them towards someone else, even if they don't do that, they spread into our character and they can make us colder and harder people. And of course, when we've chosen that path of revenge, it's a solution that makes it almost impossible for any damaged relationship we might have with them to get restored. But fortunately, there's another option when we've been wronged, one besides revenge. So that other option is we can forgive, right? We can make that difficult choice to forgive them. Now, forgiveness means refusing to make them pay for what they did. But remember, when there's a debt, someone has to pay. It doesn't just vanish. So choosing to truly forgive means that we're willing to pay the debt ourselves. Making the conscious, difficult decision to not lash out and seek revenge when someone has hurt us is agony inside. It is so painful because first, we had the pain of the original hurt that someone did toward us. And now we deny ourselves the satisfaction of inflicting that same hurt back on them. Instead, we are absorbing that debt, taking the cost of it completely on ourselves instead of taking it out on them. And that really hurts inside terribly. But rather than creating a cycle of reaction and retaliation, we find that that anger and that hurt that we have will slowly begin to subside. We're not giving it any fuel. And so the resentment will begin to burn lower and lower. Forgiveness has to be granted before it can be felt, but the feeling will eventually come. And it's the only way to stop that cycle of pain and suffering. And it also does something really magical. It opens the door for restoring the relationship with the other person that was broken because of the wrong that was done. Revenge could not do that, but forgiveness can do that. So this is exactly the same kind of situation that each of us faces with God. We stand before God having damaged our relationship with him by the sins that we've committed. God could choose to make us pay for the wrongs that he's committed, but instead, He has chosen to forgive us so that we don't have to pay the penalty for our wrongdoing. But just like when we choose to forgive someone that has hurt us, true forgiveness means bearing the cost instead of making the wrongdoer do it. Forgiveness means absorbing the debt of the hurt ourselves. So should it surprise us that when God chose to forgive us, rather than to punish us for all the ways that we have wronged him, that he went to the cross in the person of Jesus Christ and died there. On the cross, we see God doing visibly and cosmically what every human being must do to forgive someone, though on an infinitely greater scale. There's a verse in the book of Romans that summarizes this very well. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says that God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Why did Jesus have to die to forgive us? Because there was a debt to be paid, and God himself paid it. There was a penalty to be borne, and God himself bore it. It was the only way for God to truly offer us forgiveness. It was his way of extending grace to us so that our relationship with him could be restored for eternity. There's a verse in Ephesians that summarizes this really well. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7 says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, in accordance with the riches of God's grace." So where do we go from here? We've been spending time in the book of Matthew, and there is a parable in chapter 20 of the book of Matthew that tells that Jesus tells to his disciples that speaks to this very point. It's referred to as the parable of the vineyard workers. And I thought it would be easier if you watched this dramatization of it than to just hear me read it. So here we go.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon, and about 3 in the afternoon, and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" so the last will be first, and the first will be last.
So there you go. The parable of the vineyard worker. So just to summarize that story, right? The owner of the vineyard hires workers at the beginning of the day to work in his vineyard for a denarius, which is kind of the typical standard day's wages. He then hires people throughout the day, including some that are hired only about an hour before the end of the workday. And when it comes time to pay them at the end of the workday, he gives everyone the same amount. Whether you were hired at the beginning of the day or you were hired at the end of the day, you got a denarius for working. And the people who had been hired at the beginning of the day got upset because they thought they should have been paid more since they worked all day. Even though, as the vineyard owner says, I agreed to pay you and you agreed to work for the denarius at the beginning of the day, and I'm giving you what you agreed for. And he said, instead, you should be happy for my generosity that I'm showing to others. So in this parable, the vineyard owner represents God, and the wages represent the gift of forgiveness that God offers all of us because of the payment made by Jesus. The parable has something to say to us no matter where we might be in our faith journey. If you have considered yourself a Christian for years, get off that black screen. This parable is a reminder. It's easy to feel it's unfair for someone who has only just accepted God's gift of forgiveness to receive the same benefit of God's grace as someone that has faithfully served God for years. Or to feel that you should be due some extra measure of God's grace for the faithfully serving God for years, maybe making sacrifices of time and money. But that's not how God works. He lavishes grace and mercy on everyone that accepts the gift of forgiveness. And we should rejoice in God's amazing goodness. And if you're new to this idea of Christianity, I hope you take two messages from this parable. The first is that you do not have to earn your way to God's forgiveness. You don't have to work in the church for years to prove to God that you're good enough before he will give you the gift of forgiveness. It's there for you if you'll accept it. The second message is that it's never too late. God's forgiveness is something that's offered to anyone, anywhere, no matter your age or your circumstances. God chose to forgive so that he could restore the broken relationships that we have with him. We just need to accept it. Just like Valjean needed to accept the gift of the silver and the candlesticks offered by the bishop. God gives freely and fully to anyone and everyone that accepts his gift. The gift is beautifully summarized in John 3:16 that many of you have heard. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. But what does it mean to believe in him? It means more than just believing in your head. I think it can best be characterized as active trust. Imagine you're on a cliff and you lose your footing and you begin to fall. Next to you is a branch sticking out from the cliff. It's your only hope, and it's more than strong enough to support your weight. How can it save you? If your mind is certain that the branch can support you, but you don't actually reach out and grab it, then you're lost. On the other hand, if your mind is filled with doubts and uncertainty that the branch will be able to hold you, but you reach out and grab it, you're going to be saved. Why is that? It's because it's not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that saves you. Strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong branch. And in Jesus, we have a strong branch. This means you do not have to wait for all the doubts and all the fears to go away to take hold of Christ. It is not the depth and purity of your heart, but the work of Jesus Christ on your behalf that saves us. Faith begins as we seek to build a relationship with God based on what Jesus has done, not based on our moral efforts or our achievement. If you don't know where to start or you need a healthy reset, let me just close with a simple prayer that may help you on your journey. So pray with me. Father, in my head, I believe in you and Jesus Christ. I believe in the saving work that Jesus did for me on the cross. But I know that my heart continues to look elsewhere for significance and salvation. As far as I know in my heart today, I want to give it to you. I transfer my trust and my hope in you. There are days that trust will burn bright and days that trust will burn dimly. But I trust that through it all, you receive and accept me. Not for anything I have done, but because of everything that Jesus Christ has done for me. Amen. So, grace, what is it? It is that unmerited gift that God chooses to give us. Why do we need it? Because we've committed a crime and we need to do the time without that grace. And how do we get it? It's through daily placing that active trust in Jesus, that is the source of our salvation, that he has paid the price for us to be forgiven and not from anything that we do. Thank you.